In this podcast episode, historian Rafe Heydel-Mankoo discusses the politicization of history education in Britain, focusing on the myths surrounding the British Empire and its legacy. He explores the impact of leftist ideologies on historical narratives, the unique characteristics of Western civilization, and the challenges posed by immigration and demographic changes, while advocating for a more balanced and objective approach to teaching history. Rafe begins by debunking several significant myths about British history, particularly regarding the British Empire. He asserts that while the British Empire was not without its faults, it was ultimately a force for good in the world. He highlights that no empire in history has been as benign as the British Empire, which maintained its colonies with minimal military presence and often left behind beneficial institutions such as legal systems and infrastructure. In contrast, he points out the brutal practices of other colonial powers, such as the Spanish and Portuguese, and notes that former British colonies tend to be more stable and prosperous today. The podcast also discusses the concept of a revolution that has already taken place in society, suggesting that the current cultural climate reflects a long-term ideological shift. Rafe describes this as a long march through the institutions, where leftist ideologies have gradually infiltrated educational and cultural institutions, leading to a pervasive narrative that vilifies Western history and achievements. He references the 4 stages of societal takeover as outlined by former KGB agent Yuri Bezmenov: demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and normalization of a new ideology. According to Rafe, the demoralization phase has been particularly effective, resulting in a generation of students who struggle to discern truth from fiction due to a lack of comprehensive historical education. Rafe discusses the unique characteristics of Western civilization, attributing them to historical factors such as the rise of Protestantism. He argues that Protestantism fostered literacy and individualism, which in turn contributed to the West's capacity for innovation and economic prosperity. He contrasts this with non-Western societies, which often operate on kinship-based systems that prioritize collective identity over individual achievement. Challenging the notion that the Industrial Revolution was driven by slavery, Rafe points out that countries like Spain and Portugal, which had significant slave populations, did not experience the same level of industrialization as Britain. He argues that the wealth generated by the British Empire was not solely reliant on slavery, and that the economic contributions of slavery to the British economy were minimal compared to other sectors. When discussing the legacy of slavery, particularly in the context of African Americans, Rafe acknowledges the brutality of chattel slavery, but emphasizes that African Americans today are among the wealthiest black populations globally. He argues that the lives of African Americans are better than they would have been had their ancestors remained in Africa, citing economic and social indicators that demonstrate this point. The concept of generational trauma is also examined, with Rafe expressing skepticism about the idea that the descendants of slaves are entitled to reparations based on inherited trauma. He argues that the current socioeconomic status of African Americans cannot be solely attributed to their ancestors' experiences, and that the focus should be on the present and future rather than the past. Rafe discusses how societies should process past wrongs, particularly in the context of the British Empire. He acknowledges the significant wrongs committed during the empire's expansion, such as slavery and various forms of oppression. However, he argues that it is essential to recognize the positive contributions made by the British Empire, including the abolition of practices like sati, the burning of widows, infanticide, and human sacrifices in various cultures. He emphasizes that while there are stains on Britain's legacy, there are also achievements that should be celebrated, particularly in terms of women's rights and the establishment of democratic institutions. Expressing concern that society is being gaslit regarding its historical legacy, Rafe believes there is a concerted effort to undermine the West's achievements, particularly by movements like Black Lives Matter. He argues that these movements focus on historical injustices rather than addressing modern slavery and other pressing issues, suggesting that this narrative is more about attacking Western civilization than seeking genuine justice. The podcast also addresses the appeal of radical ideologies, including communism, to youth. Rafe notes that young people are often drawn to these ideologies because they seek a sense of belonging and identity. He points out that the Marxist framework of oppressor versus oppressed resonates with many young people who are naturally inclined to leftist ideologies. He highlights the various species of Marxism that have emerged, such as critical race theory, radical feminism, and queer theory, which he believes collectively undermine Western values and culture. Rafe argues that there is a rewriting of history occurring, where the achievements of Western civilization are downplayed or dismissed. He draws parallels with the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, where nations restored their national identities after the collapse of communist regimes. He warns that the current trend in the West is towards a similar erasure of historical identity, which could lead to a fractured society. The conversation also addresses the impact of immigration on British society. Rafe expresses concern about the demographic changes resulting from mass immigration, suggesting that the integration of large numbers of immigrants is becoming increasingly difficult. He cites statistics indicating that the white British population may become an ethnic minority by the mid-21st century, raising questions about the future identity of Britain. He argues that without a cohesive national identity, integration becomes challenging, especially when immigrant communities remain segregated. The issue of extremism among young British Muslims is also discussed. Rafe points out that younger generations of Muslims in Britain are often more radicalized than their parents or grandparents, which he attributes to a lack of affinity for British culture and identity. He notes that many young Muslims live in isolated communities, which can foster extremist views and practices. He emphasizes the need to address these issues directly rather than avoiding them. Referencing the Danish solution, Rafe discusses Denmark's policies to limit the percentage of ethnic minorities in communities and schools to promote integration. He argues that similar measures may be necessary in the UK to foster a sense of national identity and cohesion. Rafe suggests that minorities are often used as tools for political agendas, particularly by left-leaning parties that seek to reshape the demographic landscape to secure votes. He expresses skepticism about the future, particularly regarding immigration policies and the potential for continued demographic shifts. Despite the challenges posed by demographics and ideological shifts, Rafe remains hopeful about the possibility of restoring balance in society, particularly in the realm of education. He believes that addressing the teaching profession and ensuring a more balanced curriculum is crucial for the future. He argues that children are being indoctrinated at a young age, and without intervention, the cycle of ideological bias will continue. Finally, he criticizes the current state of historical scholarship, suggesting that ideology has overtaken objective truth in the field. He points out that left-leaning academics dominate history departments, leading to a lack of diverse perspectives in historical narratives. He calls for a reevaluation of how history is taught and understood, emphasizing the need for balance and objectivity in the discipline.